sir.
How far ahead is Russia and China in aggressive EMP, and how actually fairly better off they are, not quite as perfect, in defense against EMP?
Offensively and defensively, they're light years ahead of us. We found when on the EMP Commission that Russia has developed what they call a super EMP weapon. That is a new generation of nuclear weapons that is specifically designed to create EMP. They're basically a gamma ray producer. Very low yield on the order of a couple of kilotons or even less. But it generates a tremendous EMP pulse, an E1 pulse of like 200 kilovolts per meter. That is, for every meter of dimension in the object being attacked, you get 200,000 volts. So if it's 2 meters long, that's 400,000. And you multiply it by the dimensions of the thing. So if you can imagine the numbers of meters that are in things like telecommunications lines, which run for kilometers, you multiply that by 200,000, and that's the amount of energy.
Is this from space and hits 100 miles, 1,000 miles, or what?
Yeah, well, anything above 30 kilometers. The EMP phenomena begins up at above an altitude of 30 kilometers, but the ideal attack would be to place one about 400 kilometers over the center of the country. That puts the EMP field down over all 48 contiguous United States, and at the horizon, you know, with a 200 kilovolt peak field, you know, you're talking about 100 kilovolts per meter at the horizon. Defensively, Russia and China are the only countries in the world that have hardened their infrastructures against EMP. You know, they did it back in the Cold War because they believed you could fight and win a nuclear war. At least the Soviets did. And we now know fairly recently, because it's only been a recent discovery, about the so-called underground Great Wall that the Chinese have built. Thousands of kilometers of underground facilities, very similar to what the Russians and the Soviets before them did. And they have hardened their critical infrastructure.
Peter, excuse me, I want to add one thing. For a use in a war in Europe. So that's one of the insidious things about EMP is if you look at the capability of either Iran or North Korea to launch an accurate ballistic missile attack from any place on a target in the United States, it's stunningly difficult. But Iran now has, I think, 3 satellites up. All were launched to the south, all like a south polar orbit fractional orbital bombardment system, since all of our indicators and radars and so forth are pointed north. And you launch it, it goes into orbit or half an orbit, and then it detonates. It's not that sophisticated. And so they have 3 satellites in orbit, and are, I would say, less than a year away from having a nuclear weapon. Primitive North Korea has 1 satellite in orbit and 3 nuclear tests, all of them relatively small yield, as they would be if they were electromagnetic pulse weapons. And so it has nuclear tests, satellite. Iran has satellites, no nuclear test yet, but both are very close to where, in terms of capabilities for EMP, not for accuracy, very close to where the Soviets were on the eve of Sputnik. I was in high school when Sputnik was launched, and boy, I can tell you, the public schools of Oklahoma, and I think probably much of the rest of the country, went to general quarters. I mean, everybody was, we're changing everything. No, you're going to take 4 years of physics. You know, Sputnik had a huge impact on this country's reaction to the threat of nuclear war. And you now have 2 considerably crazier powers than the old Soviet Union was, namely Iran and North Korea, with one with both of the systems that they need, satellites and nukes, The other with the satellites, but not yet the nukes, but 20% enriched, 9 months.
Can I just follow up? How many members of the Joint Chiefs of Command could say more than 2 sentences about this?
I don't know. I don't know.
Can I ask one quick clarification? Did you say 1 to 2 kilo, not 20 kilo?
Yeah, 1 to 2 kilotons or even
So we're
less.
talking about the potential of operational use, say like detonated 50 miles off the coast of Israel and 30 miles up? That could take out,
Yeah, it's a bad day for
Yeah.
Lebanon and Egypt.
it'd be a bad day for Lebanon and Egypt, but it also blinds, it takes out Israel.
But
Yep.
let me follow up with that too, because the commission, as the Russians told us, we were visited by a delegation from Moscow, 2 Russian generals who were
Fascinating.
their top experts on EMP, to warn the commission that there had been a technology leak from Russia to North Korea on the secret of the super EMP weapon, and that they predicted, this was in 2004, that within a few years North Korea would be capable of developing a super EMP weapon. And a couple of years later, in 2006, they did their first test, which was, and all of the tests have been the same. These low-yield weapons, 1 to 3 kilotons. The Western press has tended to declare them to be failures because the yields are so low. I mean, a nominal atomic bomb should have a yield of about 10 kilotons, but these are on the order of 1 or 2 kilotons, and no leakage of radionuclides from the tests, which almost always happens, which indicates something like a pure fusion weapon, which is consistent with the super EMP weapon. In 2012, a military commentator for independently of us, South Korean military intelligence came to the conclusion that Russians were in North Korea helping them develop super EMP weapons. And then in 2012, a military commentator for the People's Republic of China said the North Koreans have got super EMP weapons. So, but to make matters worse, you don't actually need a super EMP weapon, any nuclear weapon. Our grid is not hardened at all, nor are our other,
2 cities, Indianapolis and Denver, 120 miles up.
or anywhere above 30 kilometers, anywhere over the eastern seaboard. You could use a meteorological balloon to get up that high. There was a gentleman who did he was an acrobat, and he had himself lofted up into the stratosphere above 30 kilometers with a heavy diving suit, demonstrating that you can get up to that altitude. We knew it before he did that. One of our concerns was you could use a meteorological balloon to lift any kind of warhead up to that altitude, do it anywhere over the United States, preferably someplace over the eastern seaboard, because the eastern seaboard generates 70% of our electricity. And the country can't survive without the eastern grid. You take down the eastern grid, it's all going to collapse.
Iran is now developing more drones.
Yes.
Many other countries. So how would that change the game?
I don't know that it would. You could do it with a jet fighter. They've got jet fighters. Any fighter that can do Mach 1, if you do a zoom flight high up and pilot's willing to commit suicide, you can do an EMP attack that way too.
One factoid in support of this. The deputy director of ARPA-E, ARPA for the Energy Department, did this calculation himself and told me about 3 months ago that the amount of relevant R&D done by the 3,500 American utilities is in toto less than the amount of R&D that is done annually by the American dog food industry. But we have healthy dogs, hey. There's 2 cases, Peter, you may know both of these, but let me just mention them quickly. One was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were 2 Soviet attack submarines that were armed with nuclear mines, I believe. And when the United States set its blockade and it began depth charging Soviet submarines, it scared all of them except these 2 to the surface, and the others did what the Americans wanted them to do, which was to surface, and okay, now nothing's going to happen. But the 2 that had the nuclear mines on them, it was this big torpedo that could go in a distance and then fight back. It's a mine, I suppose. There were 3 guys on those 2 nuclear boats that could decide to launch the torpedo / mine against an American ship. Two of them, it was like Yeltsin, two of them decided to launch. One guy, he was a Navy captain, and he was the commissar of the baby little fleet that had just the two boats in it. He said no. And all this came out after the Berlin Wall went down during those few years in which we had pretty good access to Soviet documentation and so forth. But that one's been written up a fair amount. The other one, that also the materials come from the same place, was that even without being a religious fanatic, Castro was just a fanatic, and Castro did everything he could, really, to get a nuclear war going between the United States and Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He knew it would kill him. He knew it would blow up Cuba. He didn't care, as long as it would destroy the United States. Yet again, Yeltsin one time, and this Soviet Navy captain another, there was a sensible Russian military officer somewhere in the system who told Castro to go to hell. You don't have to be a Shiite cleric with a vision of going immediately to visit the 72 virgins to be crazed enough in some circumstances to want a highly destructive war. Hitler wanted to rule Europe for 1,000 years and kill all the Jews. He was very careful planner about those objectives, but he had them for years. Secular, non-theocratically crazed leaders that have their hands on nuclear weapons are also a problem. You don't have to just be a religious fanatic. In, I think, the summer of 1912 or 1913, a Austrian intelligence officer wrote an analysis of the situation in Europe. And he summed it up by saying that the situation in Europe is so complex and there's so many interdepending alliances and flashpoints that could go wrong. I believe that sometime within the next 2 or 3 years, such may occur. And we would then move toward a general war in Europe. If that happens, the situation in Russia is so difficult, there would probably be a revolution in Russia. Count von Berchtold, the Austrian foreign minister, took one look at this stupid intelligence analysis and scribbled on the margin, and who, pray tell, will lead this revolution? This idiot Bronstein who spends all day playing chess at the Café Central? Trotsky.
When you talk about you can spread this idea through movies, so it will scare our terrorists, would-be terrorists. When it comes, for example, to radical Muslims, they read only the Quran. So they don't want to know anything about anything, so their exposure to influences that we can be influenced by are not there. So you're limiting it. England announced yesterday that they are working now on development of cyber attacks, which has been kind of very interesting, so I would like you to comment on that. And just two more things. One is with 9/11. I'm from New York. In New York, you couldn't call anybody. There was no communication whatsoever. All the towers went. And now when we had the hurricane again, the same thing. We couldn't communicate because cyber is gone. So landlines, nobody has a landline anymore. You cannot talk to anybody. So that's very minor issues, but yeah, we know what it is to be without communication. Talk about implanting ideas through cyber. We have Google Glasses now, right? Well, you can do many things with that. You can develop it further, and you can implant change if you work on the nervous system, if you know a little bit of neurophysiology. You can do many things in order to change perception, to change behavior as well.
How difficult after an EMP attack, within 4 months, 80% of all Americans are dead, that within 2 years, China can repopulate the western half of the country infrastructure's all there, bring their own transformers, and re-energize the country within 4 to 6 months.
You know, I look at you as more of the expert than I, but that sounds, credible.
It's a spoiler. He just did the spoiler.
It's not that hard.
Right, I mean, you really have to be prepared when you think about.
They would be here to save us. We'd be greeting them with open arms.
Yes, but
that's
because they're the
California.
bosses. Don't fool ourselves. They would be the bosses.
Well, it's also because it's California.
I said Western half to the Mississippi.
Again, I keep thinking about constituencies and building public support and building political support. We have to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of Bill Nye several years ago. We all know Bill Nye, the science guy. He put together a really neat little video called how, I think it was television or how media gets EMP wrong. And then 15 minutes, it was at an EMPACT conference where all of us were sitting there, gothic humor type, just laughing at how utterly absurd EMP was being portrayed. Such as a scene in a film where it's like, well, we're going to EMP Las Vegas, but then you only have 30 seconds and the power will come back on. We have a great task before us. Many of the things that you cited, sir, and you as well, are so fantastic, but so real. But Hollywood gets it so wrong. And therefore, when we present realities like what you've been talking about, it gets dismissed. We need to be able to get better information out from an organization like ACD saying, this is not Hollywood we're talking about
We
anymore.
should make a new movie.
Movies, documentaries, whatever.
Yeah.
One of the things that pushes me right through the wall is National Geographic's preppers and all that, which makes anybody preparing for these scenarios look like they're wearing a tinfoil hat.
Yeah.
So it behooves us to figure out strategies for communicating politically and also the constituencies. We're talking realities here. This is not sci-fi.
Bill, there is a unit that I'm involved with a little bit called the Entertainment Industries Council.
Thank God. Please explain that, because I'm hearing this for the first time right now.
They were formed to address exactly that problem, the inaccuracies in media, particularly in entertainment, of course. And what was happening was on a lot of TV shows, particularly the daytime shows, medical practices were being grossly misrepresented. So doctors, hospitals, etc., they wound up teaming through the EIC with the screenwriters in order to get it right. And why? Because they were having lots of people, particularly women, going to their doctors and saying, well, I want this, this, and this, because I saw it on TV and I know it can be done. And they would say, no, the science isn't there, or that's totally inaccurate or something. But they've had a major impact, such that a lot of TV shows and movies are now much more accurate in the medical arena. So if we were doing, I guess maybe through the ADC, work with those people a little bit better in order to start bringing a little more realistic science into these movies. There's a movie now being made of our first book, SpaceWars, and thankfully the producer has kept my co-authors and me involved from day one, because the first script they wrote was so divorced from the book, and he said, why bother?
That happened to you too.
We're now on the 5th version of the script, and we're buying off on it now. But that has to be part of the practices, is that Hollywood has to be able to work with the original writers and the smart people that know how it really works in order to get it right.
I have them call me from time to time, not because I volunteer, to advise about things like this.
And my overall experience is that they really don't care at all
You're right.
how close something is to reality. It is entirely the impression that is created and the tension and so forth. I can't even get them when they're talking about CIA officers to say officer instead of agent. As far as they're all concerned, all those guys out there are CIA agents. James Bond was 007, so it must be true of the CIA. They don't care
That's right.
about any verisimilitude. And it's You know, it would be great if they did, because it would be good for the public to be somewhat informed by things, but
Well,
I think it's pretty
It wouldn't be
hopeless.
hard to do, you know, fly guys.
Dave and I were driven crazy by the opening scene in Top Gun. Okay. So there's the so-called MiG, you know, and there's the F-14 on top of it, right?
Yeah.
And they pass it off as a MiG, and it is just an F-5. They don't care. It doesn't matter. And then the famous scene when Chuck Yeager goes supersonic. It's this ethereal religious experience, you know, the colors change and everything. And you say, you gotta be kidding me. Well, they try to dramatize it when all that really happens is the needle does this and then you're supersonic. And that's it. It has to be dramatic, and unfortunately, realism and accuracy, you know, goes by the wayside.
So it's a tough problem, but the EIC is doing a good job.
Yeah.
Is 80% of our country convinced that human nature is basically good, which not one of our founding fathers said was true, and that was what scared them the most, and they wrote about it in the Federalist Papers.
Right.
If you have a conviction that human nature is basically good, you're profoundly given to wishful thinking, and you don't want to hear any of this.
Right, exactly right. Whereas we do checks and balances because we don't trust people, and and neither did those guys in that hot summer in Philadelphia. They wanted to make sure that if you were going to do something crazy, you got checked. And the American system operates on that, and it's you're exactly right.
But it's also okay. So if you're not good, we can negotiate with you.
If you're not good, we'll make lots of concessions, so you'll be nice.
Maybe you'll like this someday.
I want to ask a mental question. I'm sorry to say this. Could you teach in an emerging mobilization of training logic and rationality to help you in a situation in which rationality is falling apart, that you don't panic? Now, you may be all by yourself, I admit that, but what I can see, even through the dynamics of the book sort of thing, they were helpless. They had no concept, they had no preparation, they never expected anything. It took them a long time to even figure out what was happening. But I think that's another big factor. No kid graduates from high school who has one clue of what logic is. Now, I know that's an inflated balloon, but I do think a lot of it is preparation.
Well, I'm from Israel. I grew up in Israel. We are prepared for terrorist attacks. We are aware of our environment. Bags are being checked. If you see a car parked for a long time, what is this car doing here? You go and you call the police. We don't treat the police as the enemy. Everybody is being checked all the time. This is why Israel has been able to prevent many incidents. But we grow up with this. So, you know, I was living in Israel and doing research and traveling a lot. I remember going into Harrods in London, and I opened my bag. And I caught myself and said, what am I doing? Somebody will take my purse, you know? Because when you go anywhere in Israel, you open your bag for inspection. American civil liberties, oh my God, you know, violation of our rights. That helps you to create an awareness and to think in a fashion that will expand really your ability to react, I think.
So we invest somewhat in logic.
Yeah.
How could we engage with 16-year-olds that they wouldn't take all this stuff as fluff?
Well, you have to start earlier, not at 16.
I would submit that what he and I are doing is one way, because if you can turn the logic into entertainment, you know, then it gets through, even to the younger generation. And that was the epiphany that I had as a writer for Aviation magazine for 22 years. I finally realized that even though I was writing for the premier aerospace magazine in the world, coming out weekly, I wasn't having near as much impact as Tom Clancy, Dale Brown, Steve Kuntz, and Dr. Forstchen, you know. Because once you wrap a story around the facts and the logic such that it hits here, that it gets to the feeling part of people and says, wow, that can impact me. So, for instance, in our Space Wars book, we tried to do exactly that. We said from day one, it's an event-driven book, it's not a character-driven book. Of course, we've taken a lot of hits for that. But we tried to say, if you knock out GPS satellites, how does it affect our daily life? And when you say, I go to the pump to get gas, and I can't get gas at the pump. I go to the ATM machine, I can't get it. We say it's like pouring molasses on society. Everything slows down and we revert to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We go inside to pay. We go inside to get cash, that sort of thing. And all of a sudden, the feedback we were getting was, I had no idea space had anything to do with my daily life that way. So I think we may have to do that same sort of thing with cyber.
I agree. The older generations, if we'll allow ourselves to be called that, have this view that younger generations understand the technology, and they don't. They know how to use the technology, but they have no idea how it works. And so they're in no better position to rebuild on a technological basis, and certainly have no way of getting back to ground on a survivalist basis, because they've grown quite lazy in their reliance on technologies. So it's unfortunately not usually as simple as even giving up the technology and reverting, because we've put ourselves in a position where there's nothing to revert back to.
That if something goes wrong, you fix it and make it perfect, because that's the way it was designed to be, and that's the only worthy objective. You neglect an entire aspect of things you can do, such as use software in such a way as to make islanding a lot easier, and to have some, maybe not a whole supply, but some solar on the roof and battery in the basement, so that if the grid goes, you can island and you can at least have, let's say, 40% of the electricity you might have otherwise, 30%. But the difference between 30 or 40% and zero is the difference between a serious problem and the end of civilization. And people somehow get into the business of something goes wrong, you got to fix it, and it has to be exactly the way it was designed and we want it all to be, not build in resilience, figure out a way that we can at least cope, at least charge a cell phone and something, even if the grid goes. And the whole attitude toward risk, and it fits in with what you were saying, I think, earlier, anything fails, let's get in there and fix it and make it all perfect again. And anything short of perfect is worthless.
Right, it's this idea of restoration, that you're restoring the original as opposed to converting or pivoting to another factor that won't be similarly vulnerable. The problem with the restoration view is that you could keep, it's like the scene in Cool Hand Luke where the Paul Newman character keeps getting up just to be punched again. The idea of restoring to standing up is of no value if you retain the same vulnerability and the threat is out there, right? You might have to pivot, and we haven't been thinking that way.
But the examples that you give, going back to Bill, is right, because you remember movies, you quote movies, this is part of the, okay, so
I agree.
we have to do something.
But then they better be accurate.
Yeah.
So I agree there too, right?
Even the testing that I did for years, the idea of graceful degradation. So if you lose something in the air, you still have enough to get yourself
The helicopter
on the
can
ground.
still get down.
Yeah, or you go to
Yeah.
reduced instruments. All the electricals are down, but you still have a little standby attitude indicator, and I can get on the ground.
Somehow, though, the aviation industry, I think, has grasped that, at least in my exposure to the electricity business and so forth, they have not. Indeed, the whole infrastructure has not. My wife and I are sailors, and whenever you sail under a bridge, you tend to see cable crossing, terrorist, if you want to cut something, cut it here. We've gone from 1865 until 9/11 with, except for a few months after Pearl Harbor, without a single thought being given by anybody who had anything to do with the American infrastructure that anybody might attack it or do anything. I mean, nuclear war, yeah, with Soviets, but our infrastructure has been put together without a single thought being given to resilience. It's not that it has some flaws, it's that nobody thought about it at all except in protection of nuclear power plants. That's it. But even then, they'll often have the transformer outside the fence so the terrorists can take out the transformer, just not the plant.
Perhaps, Sid and I have talked about this. I refer to it as islands of recovery.
There you go.
Being in the Charlotte area, Lowe's are great big box home repair depot systems. Perhaps at some point, ACD should be talking with some of our major private industries, like Lowe's, for example, forming an alliance as the idea of an island of recovery, that they know how to begin rebuilding an infrastructure. That if the crap hits the fan, you know that you can go to these various points of islands of recovery to get emergency issues taken care of, but also to begin the rebuilding process. In the same way we see the changing of strategy with mobile warfare, World War I, World War II, where linear defense was simply just punched through, and the realization you had to have defense in depth. That you had islands of recovery 50, 100, 150 miles back to re-stitch together, as the Germans did in Russia in 43. So perhaps we should be talking at some point about which major private corporation should we be approaching as becoming allies in islands of recovery.
There's also some other potential allies that might strike at most all of us as fairly odd. I gave a speech not long ago about all this resilience and electricity grid and so forth to a group that had been a mix-up, and I was speaking to. It was an extremely left group, a large group of students, and the idea of being spoken to by a former CIA director, they were just about to run and start throwing stuff.
What was it better than betrayal experience?
I started talking about this resilience stuff. I started paying attention. They came up afterwards, a bunch of them. They said, "You know why we like this?" I said, "We're all locavores. We won't eat anything that is grown more than 100 miles from here. We think everything ought to be local, and we've never heard anybody who had anything to do with industry somewhere talking like that." So the idea of resilience and being able to do some things locally, not everything, but some things, fit together in the minds of a lot of people who would be very uncomfortable in this room and would be wearing their Birkenstocks and all that. But there's some interesting folks in that world who have some very parallel ideas.
For example, Whole Foods. Whole Foods concentrates on buying food when they buy mangoes from, I don't know, South Africa, but they also have local, and they increase their local sales of local products. So maybe talking more with them. They are conscious, at least starting somewhere, in order to get more, awareness for that.
Reagan promised Gorbachev, "I will give you all of our advanced technology for what became known as Star Wars." They couldn't believe it. They didn't have much money to start with. So the larger question is, what could we do to go to the Russians and ask them to give us their advanced technology on EMP defense? Maybe it's a pipe dream?
How much money can you get together to give it to Putin? I don't know.
It probably is with Putin, but it might not have been at some point with Gorbachev or Yeltsin on some things. They didn't think the way Putin does.
You know, most cities have emergency plans for whatever kind of emergency occurs in those cities. And a lot of these issues must be addressed. Maybe, they don't necessarily care if it's an EMP-driven electrical failure, or if it was like 10 years ago when the East Coast effectively went down from Canada to Ohio. So it seems to me there's an awful lot more being done as far as emergency readiness on a city by city basis, and there's conferences across the nations in terms of what best can we do and what are you doing and how are you preparing, and so what are they not addressing this sufficiently, obviously, but are they not addressing it at all, or where could that be strengthened? Because they're the first responders,
I'd
right?
like to take
I
that
live in-
question.
Okay.
If you go to the local and state level emergency responders, you will hear a refrain from them quite often that the Department of Homeland Security says that they will be there in 72 hours. 72 hours.
I believe them.
Yeah, and and I think it is self-evident that the lack of preparedness, Katrina, Andrew, Hurricane Sandy, that just happened, and that we knew was coming 2 weeks in advance. You know, it's appalling how unprepared we are, even for normal meteorological events that nature throws at us, tornadoes. So, no, we're not really anything like adequately prepared, even to deal with natural disasters. And if we can't cope with a Katrina, we're not going to be able to cope with an EMP.
And if I can throw in just an additional comment, you know, we deal so much with commercial entities, and commercial entities say that their response is already planned and calculated. It's called insurance. And if they have a disaster, they'll simply go out of business and accept the insurance payment.
Yeah.
I can add. I was teaching at the Army War College, and we were looking at this issue. We found out that what we believe most people would do would be to come immediately to military facilities if there were a large catastrophic event. And they would come there for protection, for food, for water, for whatever they thought that the military facilities would have. Unfortunately, as the Colonel knows, military facilities are no longer set up that way. We do the same kinds of consumer, just-in-time consumer businesses as the civilian population does.
Everyone except China Lake is on the grid.
Yeah. So
If
we
I-
would be,
Yeah.
If I could throw a corporate model, sir, you were involved with Lowe's for many years, were you not? I think this is worth listening to for a minute about how a corporate for-profit enterprise deals with a disaster. So, sir, if you'd introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Greg Westling, and I currently work with the Noah Foundation with Sid Morris. But I spent almost 35 years with Lowe's. And the story starts in 1989. That's when Hurricane Hugo came to the Charleston area and devastated, at that time, 53 of Lowe's stores and thousands of their employees and hundreds of thousands of their customers. And the truth is, we were so flat-footed we didn't know what to do. We learned pretty quickly that the time to plan for a disaster is not 5 minutes after it occurred. And so we got through it, and we vowed to put in place a program that would never put us in that position again, aimed at our customers first, but certainly equally to our employees. And it kind of answers your question. Most disasters have boundaries, and people know best how to work within those boundaries. Some of the things that you folks are talking about today have much broader boundaries, and that's why I think they're a much greater threat. Back to the Lowe's story, so we spent a couple of years developing strategic plans, putting in a disaster recovery center, which I've spoken with Bill about on several occasions. What we learned were three things. One, if you can come back quickly and help the community can get back on its feet. But because a store like a Lowe's requires people to work inside the store, you have to take care of your employees. And they won't come to work unless they know their families have been taken care of. So we put a plan in place to take care of our employees, the employees' families, and then in turn they could come to work and take care of the communities. And then we built a logistics plan to get the product back into the stores. People think that's easy. It's not. The road that you used yesterday to get generators to the store or roofing products to the store or whatever the disaster may be, it's no longer open. And even if it is, people that would like to have those generators or that roofing don't want it to get to the store. Right. They want it, Jim, you know that. They want to take it, and they believe it's theirs for the taking. So it's a tremendously complicated plan. We spent 20 years perfecting it, and I'm retired now from Lowe's, but I know that plan is alive and in place.
If I could just elaborate for a second, it is an actual disaster center at their corporate headquarters, staffed 24/7, has timelines and clocks. Like, for example, we talked about Sandy, that a week before Sandy hit, while the government was sitting flat-footed, you were already pre-positioning emergency supplies and emergency equipment for your personnel and for the community recoveries. The disaster at the Sanford, North Carolina tornado incident, you had a full reaction team in there within 12 hours.
Well, New York didn't have anything. Sandy happened, and
Why?
hospitals were out. Everything was out.
I'm intrigued with...
Not NYU.
NYU. No, what do you mean? NYU?
It did not go out because they had a cogen system set up in such a way that they'd done
NYU,
over
all their computers went.
what but they had some resilience.
But their computers went, so they didn't have any computers.
Well,
so
at least they still had civilization.
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
so than-
To close, my point to close is, there's private models out there.
Yeah, excellent. Yes, please.
I, listening to Bill talk, we were both at Aviation Week where we did information writing, which is the who, what, why, how, when, where, and then storytelling, which I've been studying since Bill became a novelist. These two fellows do the character, narrative, motive. It's more appealing, but very few thriller novelists get the information in there at all, much less write. It's kind of anathema to storytelling. But I think you could develop a communications plan for EMP because it's a discrete problem with a solution that has money that's reasonable, whereas cybersecurity is broad and diffuse and much more challenging problem. And the thing is, I think you could go to the best narrative nonfiction writers in the country. You could get these subject matter experts in front of Mike Lewis, who wrote The Big Short, and John McPhee, who wrote a story about nuclear bombs, and talked to the fellow who designed some of our largest and smallest nuclear weapons from the New Yorker, and he was in the World Trade Center towers, and he said to this fellow, well, what would happen with a small nuclear device? He said, it would knock the two towers into the river. And then he wrote a magazine article and a book, but you can identify the very best narrative nonfiction writers in the country and go to them. And since the media industry has collapsed into everybody does everything and nobody knows anything, you find the people who know, who are concerned about getting the facts right, and then you go to them. They don't have time to get up out of their desk and come down here to Washington and meet with you guys. But if you had a communications program with a little money behind it, it wouldn't have to be a lot. You could get some impact and then maybe build consciousness to get a bill passed to, what is it, $500 million?
That's a very interesting idea.
Well, they usually require big advances and publications that will publish them, and it's a big problem. Yes.
I want to ask,
There's another way.
how come Lowe's make this region by region a national missionary effort?
I'm probably not qualified to answer that question.
I'm talking about human spirit.
Well,
I'm talking about the board of Lowe's.
Well, it's there. I mean, the philanthropic arm of Lowe's has been alive and well for over 50 years. So I think getting a group together that has a plan and a need with some folks with the company could yield some real results.
One of the points that I would stress are the number of assumptions our emergency response plans have in them of what is still available to you as a resource. And that's really what you need to press against, right? This notion that we have employees, it was absolutely brilliant and necessary to recognize that your employees are not coming to work if their families are not taken care of. We saw that in Katrina, that public citizens, right? You have people who are public servants who are trying to, but if their families are in harm's way, they're being put into a bad choice. We've done exercises, cyber exercises, where it's assumed that the internet is still working. On a cyber exercise, no less. And so you're saying, well, what if it's not? And we're like, well, we're not ready to handle that exercise yet. And it reminds me of this economics joke for those of you who don't really think that macroeconomics have really brought us where we need to. It's an economist is trapped on an island. And he's trying to figure out how to get off the island. And he says, well, assume I have a helicopter. And so those assumptions matter. And what we're talking about today, right, are that the assumptions that are built into a lot of our emergency response plans are invalid.
And one way to vet that is through good wargaming.
Yes.
And wargaming is not adequately used in a lot of circles. The
Agreed.
military does a good job. The Navy is the best at it. But my co-author took wargaming. He was a wargaming expert in the Navy, in the commercial community. And what he found was that most large corporations spent lots of time and money developing a 5-year plan. And as soon as something happened that wasn't in the plan, over the shoulder, and they were just winging.
Right.
So what he taught them was how to look at alternate futures. And, what to say, if this happens, then what?
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly
Very
what is
good.
necessary, because you can blow those assumptions out of the water.
Right.
That's crucial, and what often happens is after the first round of the war gaming, they change the assumptions so that the really tough stuff can't come up again.
I would also like to add there, the reason why the Air Force, and I'm going to throw a little jab at my own service, the Air Force is notoriously bad at wargaming because we want to exercise everything. So every war game we have always ends in a nuclear war. And but we end up inviting policymakers and diplomats and think tankers, oftentimes arms control people, to our war games, and so they think any move we make automatically concludes in a nuclear war. And we have actually carefully trained our arms control community to take us down because we expose them to bad wargaming.
Yes, please.
Very interesting, going back to the original question, which is why don't we have a constituency and how can we get one? And if we can raise the specter of this class of high impact threats that makes it impossible for others from far away to come rescue us anytime soon, but before the fear sets in, create the hope that all of us can create 20% or so of whatever we need to survive locally so we can help ourselves and our neighbors, then what we can do is enlist everyone at the local level to be empowered to do something, as opposed to telling them, you are helpless, you're incompetent, you need me to rescue you. So just vote for me or do something in Washington, as opposed to let me in Washington or let me in the state capitol empower you to do something for your community. And so somehow we need to change the game and change the mentality that local is where the hope is. And
Become community organizers.
And I want to say something.
That's true to a large degree, is that when a disaster happens in a locality, you get some things go really bad, but you get people being unbelievably helpful to their neighbors.
I want to say something optimistic because it's hard to come by in this area. I'm in a venture capital business, and one really exciting thing over the course of the last relatively few years is what's happening to batteries. 15 or 20 years ago, a battery was a battery was a battery. You did not have bright young graduates of Caltech and Stanford and MIT starting up battery companies. You do now. I tell you, they're all over the place. And they're using all kinds of new technology, and they get it. They understand that you want them to be cheap and reliable, that you don't want to have to buy the ingredients from China and so on and so forth. The combination of the progress that solar cells have made, they're not as much as you'd like, but they're a lot better than they were just a couple of 3 years ago, makes it possible for some limited amount of load and generation to match up the load with the generation and to be able, from batteries in the basement, not sexy high energy density batteries that go on a Tesla, but just big, lunky, safe, cheap batteries. Batteries in the basement, solar cells on the roof, and 20, 30, 40% of your electricity, even if the grid goes. That builds into the system a certain degree of and it's not complicated, and you can people are now starting to do this, and that builds a certain amount of resilience into the system that makes it possible to still have some food, some communication, some of this, some of that. And you're starting to see this in developing countries, sometimes on a very primitive level. In the markets in Bangladesh today, you can buy for about $25 about 3 watts, not kilowatts, watts of solar panels, a tiny radio, a cell phone charger, and a little fan. They all run, and a little battery, and they all run off the solar panels. So the wife and the family doesn't have to walk 5 miles to the next village to get the cell phone charged by a really expensive diesel generator. The little fan, you can sit in the shade and it'll keep you cool. The kids can read at night. Whoa, it has 3 LEDs. So the kids can read at night and do their homework. Changes the life for about $25 of a Bangladeshi in a village. A Bangladeshi in a village is going to be better off than most of us if the grid goes down. He's at least got 3 or 4 watts. We ain't got nothing.
Right, but look where we are. We're talking about survivalism instead of dominance, which is, I think, a pretty sad state of affairs for this country.
But you got to survive before you can dominate.
I agree. But it's quite remarkable, right, what we've got into.
Basically, the Noah Foundation's whole fundamental reason for being was, I've read
Bill's book. Quite a few sleepless nights, decided that get Peter and Cindy come down, and they came down and met with our little war room about what we were going to do about it. It boils down to one thing, is you've got to be, the only person that's going to protect you is you and your family. So you got to start there with the family. NOAA stands for Neighborhoods and Alternative Homes. And our whole concept is, if you were to go on our website, you'd see that we've developed a system where, like Jim's talking about, where every family for very low dollar can start at level, we've got the basic plan, a little better plan than that for water, 6 different ways to get water, food. We've just developed an emergency food supply program for hospitals that were very close to finishing up a 40 hospital package for one of the largest hospital groups in the Charlotte area. The hospitals are required to have 72 hours worth of emergency food supply. They said that's the rule. And they said, well, we've got it. Where is it? Well, our food suppliers got it in the warehouse. So every day they bring a truck in, and if that truck didn't get there, then they would have a hospital with no one to eat. So we put a program together. It just so happens that our food system that we had developed was from the Amish, and it was healthy anyway, and it was a very low sodium. Whoever thought about having healthy food for long-term food storage when you have to have an MRE to give a soldier a lot of energy? So they're now buying our program to put it on site, and we can put enough food in a closet to supply that whole hospital for 3 days. And then it all just needs water, and so they came up with a water program because of the power line. We didn't have any water, so it wouldn't do you any good, because if you don't have water, you turn the faucet off. So all we did was we developed a 2,000-gallon tank that set in line with the city water supply that automatically shut off if the power went off. There's 2,000 gallons already there. So you just add the water, you heat it, you feed your hospital.
Somebody put on the theater screens in January 1938 a really scary, realistic movie about what was coming to Britain.
Yes.
If they'd done that in 1938, they would never have given away Czechoslovakia. And I think it's really critical that we find different modalities to reach the broad public, which is only going to respond to something that rapidly grabs their attention.
There's
a lot to
real
that.
quick with an example.
We have to speak with Angelina Jolie, I guess.
That one example of how quickly you can change the mentality of a group, I thought was absolutely brilliant by the Missile Defense Agency a few years ago, because they were taking a lot of hits in the media. This is stupid, we don't need it, it's too expensive, it doesn't work, right? So out there, close where I live in Colorado Springs, Falcon Air Force Base, MDA brought in reporters from all over the nation. So we had the New York Times, we had all the big ones there. So as an Av Week guy locally, I was placed in this exercise. It was all done by computers mostly, a little bit of war game there. And my task was to fire 6 missiles at interceptors when things were coming out of Korea. But it was fascinating because they let the New York Times guy, who was the biggest critic, he got to play president. Okay. And it came down to where he had to decide, do I take a chance on losing this city or that city? Because if I make the wrong decision and one of them gets through, we're in trouble. That was so powerful. You could see overnight how the tone of the reporting changed on a nationwide basis. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that analogy fits in here, but it's a tool that really works to address some of the media problems that Dr. Pai was talking about.
Well, we've got to do something with them, because what they're doing now is
So wargaming
completely
would be useful.
unhelpful.
Wargaming is a powerful educational tool.
So in business, they talk about it more as scenario planning.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe a better analogy than wargaming, because it's still
No,
a
scenario
what-if
planning, you're right.
question.
Yeah.
And what if this scenario comes to place, and what
Yeah.
if that scenario comes to place, and and in fact, I mean,
And maybe
scenario
people-
planning by Shell was credited with South Africa coming out in such a non-lethal manner from
A
apartheid.
lot of people get spooked by the word war, and so
Yeah.
might as well call it
Scenario, wonderful.
And, I mean, and it is used in business world all the time,
Yeah.
so I think that it does make sense.